Well, hey there, friends. Happy Friday. If this is Friday when you're watching it. If not, I hope you're looking forward to Friday. What you see arrayed before you are four of the decks that I happen to be using most when I read lately for clients, aside from the ones that I've been using on Instagram, which are either new decks or decks that I've had for a while and want to reconnect with. And these are arrayed before you, not because I'm going to do much with them today, but I wanted to have something on the frame while I introduced what I'm about to do, which is to chat with you about some of the decks that over the 17 or 18 years I've been reading. I think I started I started when I was 18 or 19, so that would have been like 1998, 1999. So, yeah, 20 years or so. Of reading, and what I wanted to do was, like, in that time, share the decks that got the most attention from me, that sort of became, for whatever reason, my primary reading decks for a lengthy period of time. You know, they became sort of the ones that I would carry with me exclusively, use almost exclusively. There were I always had a lot of decks, so I would intersperse them with others, but by and large, they were the decks that were the ones that were my workhorses for a very specific and lengthy period of time. And I haven't, in a while, actually since the last one I'm going to show you, I haven't really had a deck that I've really stuck to, because I've had so many recently. But these are the ones that are most commonly used for me right now, especially when I'm reading for others. Of course, we've got my Marshmallow. This is the Japaridza, which I use both for myself and others, and is definitely getting some use a lot because I love it and was totally not expecting to. This is the Anima Mundi, which I backed on Kickstarter and which I love and which I find I hate the word very, which I find really useful for client readings. And then this is sort of my go-to Rider-Waite-Smith edition or version, clone, derivative, grandchild. This is the 8 coins, and I have actually two versions of it. I have this trimmed version, which I trimmed and edged in black, or actually I trimmed and edged it in gray, and then you can't even see it anymore. I think it's all worn off, but I used those sparkle markers I talked about. So these are the decks that are getting the most use for me or from me when I read for others right now. And then arrayed in front of me are a handful of decks, really a large handful of decks, that in the years since I started reading were or have been like the decks for me, the ones that I use most. So let's clear the decks, as it were. I'll put all these over here. And I'm going to try to do this in roughly chronological order, but I don't super remember everything, because that is a long time. So my first deck was I've talked about this before. My first deck was the original Rider-Waite Tarot pack, which I've showed many times. I did not bring it out. I did use it a lot. But early in my reading life, I used Rider-Waite-Smith exclusively because it was the system I learned and it was all I really understood. So this is, I think, the first sort of Rider-Waite-Smith deck that I used pretty regularly that did not use Pamela Coleman Smith's artwork. Now, I no longer have the box for this one. This is what the backs look like. I feel like, if I remember correctly, this is the Universal Weight by, I think it's a Lo Scarabeo deck, and it was by D'Angelis, I think was the artist's last name. And the reason that I used this one was that it was actually recommended by the guy who at the time was the director, I don't know what the title was, of the American Tarot Association, and there was a review of it, and it was sort of it was just a really positive review, and I was really young and impressionable, so I did, sort of whatever my betters told me. Turns out, I don't even remember, but there was a lot of scandal around the ATA shortly thereafter, a few years after I started reading, but I don't even remember what it was about, but there was a lot of scandal. So this is a pretty straight up Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and I'm not going to do walkthroughs of all of these. It's sort of a little walk down memory lane in a way. And I actually would love to hear what yours were if you've been reading, and you've had periods of time where you're really stuck to a specific deck. So this is a deck that I used a lot, and I never really connected with it, but it was an interesting deck because I tried to force myself to use it. And of the bunch, I can see just looking at it, it's the least worn. And weirdly, I actually, I got this because I was looking for something, an alternative to Rider-Waite-Smith. This is very Rider-Waite-Smith, but I don't like the artwork as much as Pamela Coleman Smith, so it's just a really interesting thing. So we won't belabor that. We can go into some of the pips. You can see they're just redrawings. So this is, pretty straight up copy, of Rider-Waite-Smith. So that I tried to make useful, and we never connected, but I never got rid of it. Now this next one I used a lot, and I don't think I've ever shown it on this channel. If I have, I don't remember. And I haven't looked at it in years. I, again, no longer have I'm just looking for, I don't know if you can see how dirty it is. Like, this deck got used. It got used a lot. So this was, for a long time, kind of this was the deck I read for pretty much everybody with, for a very long time. So this would have been next in order. And I think, in a way, this was the deck I really sort of, like, cut my teeth on. This is the one that I really... I really learned how to read with this deck, and I used it a lot. And this is, I can't even remember the name of it. Mary Hanson Roberts, I believe, is the artist of this. It's terrible. I really should have Googled this. I thought I knew who it was. The Universal Weight by US Games was recolored by the same artist. I think it's Mary Hanson Roberts. I'll try to remember to go and look. Actually, I have the Universal Weight box over here because that's what that was in. I'm right, Mary Hanson Roberts. So I can't remember the name of the deck, but the artist was Mary Hanson Roberts. So this, again, was a Rider-Waite-Smith descendant, but as you can see, I mean, this is a pretty famous deck, but it had its own voice. It's a little more cartoon-like, and ultimately I think it was friendlier, and at that point in my reading life, like, that's sort of what I needed, was a gentler hand. But looking at it now, I can see why I did use it a lot, because it was really bright. The colors were really rich, and the coloration of this deck I think is actually even better than the Universal Weight that US Games published, because there's just a richness to these cards. So, even looking at it now, I can see why this was a deck that I really used a lot. And it might just be called the Hanson Roberts Tarot. But again, there's nothing revolutionary here. It's Rider-Waite-Smith. It's just Rider-Waite-Smith through a more, I don't know what the word is, just a different lens, I guess, just a different artist's iteration of the cards. They are closer to playing card size, and so they were easier to work with. They were easier to carry around, and there was just sort of a gentleness to the deck, which I found really accessible at that point, which is, again, what I needed. I mean, I definitely, when I look at the journey of my evolution as a reader over time, it's been an evolution, because I read very differently now from when I started. And when I started, I was very much about never predicting anything, and it was really about psychology. I made a joke the other day to a friend that, how does any 19-year-old read tarot? But of course, so many of us all started, and there are many young people out there who are really good at it. I was not when I started, but I feel like in a weird way, and this may be a very controversial statement, I feel like you can't really become a great reader until you've had your heart broken. You know what I mean? Like, life, there's just something about getting older and life happening to you that makes you to just get better and better over time. And so maybe a better way, a more generous way to phrase that is that you keep getting better the more life happens to you, you know. Because it wasn't like my teens were easy. I definitely did not have, you know, when I was 19, I was sort of just realizing that the religion of my childhood was bunk, and I was having my heart broken over and over again, and trying to sort of reconcile my sexuality with the world around me and the religion that I grew up with. And so maybe that's just an old person's looking back and being a snob about being a good reader. You know, I mean, I definitely started giving readings to friends right away, and they're like, holy shit, how'd you know that? So something about this always worked. So this is the Hanson Roberts deck, I think is what it's called, and it was probably, of this bunch, the one I used the longest, and the one I read with most often for a very long time in my formative years. And so in a way, this is the deck that sort of shaped my early reading life. And then, with time, I think that I grew resistant to all of the Christian imagery because, again, you know, as I just said, I was sort of wrestling with the religion of my childhood and my own sense of the world and my own place in it. And so I started looking for things that weren't quite as Christian because I needed, at that point, to really get away from that. And so the Robin Wood Tarot was the solution to that. So here's the backs. This is, again, a pretty... I mean, I don't think there's anything in here that's like, oh my god, I've never seen that before. But I really fell in love with this deck and used it a lot for a long time. And again, this is a Rider-Waite-Smith deck that just sort of takes away the Christian imagery, or a lot of the Christian imagery, and replaces it with a more earth-centered, pagan, Wiccan, Celtic lens, and does so really beautifully. These are, again, really beautiful cards. There's one or two cards that I really hate, but that seems to be the case with decks that I really love, like the Japaridza. I really hate the War card, just hate it. But you know, and if we get here, you'll see the Wheel of Fortune card in this deck. I think is one of the worst Wheels of Fortune ever. But aside from the fact that this is an entirely white deck, I still really like it. And I think it's some of the most beautiful art. And these pencils, these Prismacolor pencils she used, I think Robin Wood is a she, to make this deck. I probably shouldn't assume gender. You know, there's just a real richness to this. It also has one of my favorite Magician cards, because the Magician in this deck is hot. So it's a very sort of blonde white person deck, but I always loved the Suit of Pentacles in this deck. And, you know, again, I wasn't really thinking much about the world outside of my own perception of it at the time. And it's not like, you know, all of these decks are not diverse, I would say, you know, except for one. And that's just the reality, you know, and again, I know people get really angry when I talk about this stuff, but that just makes me realize I haven't done a good enough job changing people's minds. So anyway, that's not the topic of this video. So this was a deck I used a lot. It was a deck that took what I was familiar with and took out all the stuff, essentially, that I didn't like, and that made me uncomfortable, and that was upsetting, and not upsetting, but that just had pissed me off, I guess, by that point. Let's find the Magician. Because, oh, this is the Wheel of Fortune card, which literally looks like the Wheel of Fortune, like the game show. Where is he? Oh, I always like the Knight of Pentacles too. There's something about the Knight of Pentacles I always felt drawn to. In this, where is he? There he is. Hello, sailor. So loved this deck and used it a lot, and then as time went on, I found other things, and one of the things I found was independently published decks, and so I briefly returned to a very, very Rider-Waite-Smith deck with the Illuminated Tarot. I really should have researched people's names before I went and did this, but I believe Carol Herzer is the artist who did this, and this is a deck I used a couple on some old videos, and I couldn't find it for a long time. I had no idea where it went. I think it fell behind a shelf. So this is a self-printed deck which is still available as far as I know. I don't know if the printing technique has changed over the years, but it was essentially paper that was laminated on both sides. So it's very bendy, but it worked really well. And what she was doing at the time, and again, I don't know if you can see this, but before she laminated it, she would paint iridescent paint on them. And if, you had to pay extra for that. This was very expensive, and very expensive for me at the time, certainly. But kind of just a breathtaking, beautiful, I mean, even looking at it now, I'm sort of in awe of the work she did on this. So it's straight up Rider-Waite-Smith, except for the quartz, I believe, which she associated with the astrological associations. But there are a lot of options. This is my favorite card in the Rider-Waite-Smith, and this may be my favorite version of it. Oh my god, isn't that beautiful? It's so pretty. Oh, I love this so much. And, I don't read with it much, but it's not an indie deck that I worried about reading with because it is so sturdy. Yeah, so you can see it's not the Queen of Wands, it's Leo. But you know who this is if you know the deck. But just the energy and the vibrancy and the swirling, it's like Van Gogh. Look at that. I love this deck so much. So, so this was my first indie deck, and I assumed all of them would be this good, and they were not. I mean, she was doing something nobody else was capable of doing at that point. So, this is a deck that I used pretty much only for myself for a long time. I didn't use it when I was reading on the ATA networks. I just used it for me. But, so good. And one of the things she did was that it came in a bag that she made, and you could get the card you wanted on it. And so the Fool has always been one of my favorites, especially in the Rider-Waite-Smith. So, yeah, I mean, oh god. So I'm fairly sure you can still get this deck. I don't know if she still prints it in the same way. I don't know if she still does the iridescent embellishments, but dear God, is it gorgeous. I'm just looking to see if there's anything else that really bears showing. There's really nothing else like this out there in the world. I kept wishing that this would get picked up by a publisher. So I'm just trying to go through quickly and see if there's any other cards that I really need to show, but I don't think there are. Oh, let's show the Empress, because the Empress has always been one of my favorite of Pamela Coleman Smith's drawings. So yeah, I always hoped that this would get picked up so that I could have another copy of it in case something happened to this one, and I'd have a backup because it was really expensive. But it always, it shuffles really well. It actually riffle shuffles for a deck that was hand cut. I don't know how she did it, I don't know how she made something work so well, but it's just a good one, and I was sad I couldn't find it for a long time, but it's back, and I'm very, very happy about that. Now I can't remember if this next one came before or after the one I just showed you. I really, my timeline gets wonky, and this one I won't show too much because I've showed it many times and actually just did a video about it, or included it, but it's the World Spirit deck. And this was a deck that was pretty much, for a few years, the deck I read with exclusively. And this is, last time I showed you the version that was my backup copy. This is the one that I actually used, and I have the silk bag for it that I ordered from a website that I think is no longer around. I have a couple of them. But again, I was, absolutely still in Rider-Waite-Smith world at this point. And still to this day adore this deck. there's just not enough good things I can say about it. There's that controversial baby card. Again, this is back in print, but this was the first deck that made me think, oh, these tarot decks are not showing the world the way it really looks. Interesting. You know, this is sort of my white privilege in action, you know. But this was just one of the first things that made me realize the world worked differently than I thought it did. You know, so this was a really eye-opening deck for me. It came into my life at a very strange time in the world. This was 2000. This definitely was after the one I just showed you, because this one I got probably 2000 or 1999. This one was 2001, because I remember getting it just around September 11th, 2001. So this is a deck that I hold near and dear to my heart. I have a lot of wonderful memories of using it. And again, it's a deck that really I adore, and I'm just, you know, so happy to have it. It's large for a published deck, but it, you know, I never really had any problem shuffling it. And the backs I always thought were interesting, you know, because their whole thing, I think this deck also introduced me to light and shadow as concepts for the cards, and it also introduced me to the way that they worked with the courts, which was Seer, Seeker, Sibyl, and Sage, which was to me a really revolutionary way of looking at the courts. On and off throughout that time, this again was probably, yeah, if I'm thinking correctly, this would have been even before no, it wouldn't have been. I don't remember. For a very short and intense period, the Albano Waite was my go-to Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and it was my go-to deck, and I think it was because I really liked the backs, and I have a little bit of a rebel spirit, and I liked the weird coloring, and it's weird. It's really weird. Yeah. So that's a deck that I brought out. Just, you know, it makes me laugh now because I never use it. I'll probably never get rid of it because, you know, I do have fond memories of working with it. But gosh, I do not know. I do not know why I used it so intensely. But sometimes the things we need come and make themselves, oops, I'm sort of losing the balance on my table here. They make themselves known as needed, and then they are. So only a couple more, and yeah, only a couple more really. So this is the deck that followed, I don't know, I think I had given up on tarot for a while, and then this was the deck that kind of drew me back in. So this is the Shadowscapes. And again, for a few years, I used this pretty much exclusively. One of the most beautiful decks ever, I think. I recently, in a trade, got the Czech version, which I never would have bought, but I'm happy to have. And I may, because it's a little bit larger, and you can just see the images a little bit better, and of course it's packaged beautifully, and the gilded edges, and it was sort of the version of the packaging and the production that this deck really deserved. And I have to figure out whether I'm going to sort of give myself on the card some clue as to what each one is, because this is not a deck that's easy to tell at first glance what card is what. You know, if there's a downside to this deck, it's that. And so when the titles are not in English and there's no cognates, I'll need some clues. But I'll figure out how to do that. I adore this deck. I still adore this deck. This deck really brought me back in, and it really, actually, it was about the time I started this channel. I think 2012. So this deck is sort of, I think I owe this channel to this deck in many ways, because I picked it up in a bookstore one day and I just fell head over heels in love with it. And I think it's, again, one of the most beautiful decks ever. For, you know, it's oddly diverse too, because there are, you know, a lot of the characters in it aren't expressly human, but there's a lot of differences in skin tone and you know, ethnic qualities, you know what I mean? It's just, and it lives in this fantasy world, so it sort of gets to play fast and loose with what the characters look like, and so some of them are very human, some of them aren't remotely, but oh god, do I love this deck so much. I mean, just the flow and the, oh my god, and the thing that people who love this deck frequently complain about is that the cards are small, which mostly we don't complain about, but there's so much happening in this deck, and what you can't ever see when you're doing a reading, but you can see when you're looking at images of these cards online, is the talent of this painter, of Stephanie Puman Law. The talent, the way that she handles the watercolors, the chi in these cards, you know, it's just breathtaking. There's so much energy in each one of them. And just gorgeous, gorgeous. And the way the techniques that she used, when you look at these up close, I mean, God, it's breathtaking. I mean, this is a breathtaking deck. I really can't think of another one in my collection that's more beautiful. And again, I have a very kind place in my heart for it because it's sort of, I think it marked a transition point in my life as a reader. I think it was the point where I sort of rededicated myself to being really good and sharing what I learned, which is what I wanted this channel to do. I really love it so much. Just so much. I no longer have the guidebook. I sent it to a friend, but you don't even really need it. And I don't know. God, isn't this pretty? I mean, it's just so pretty. So I mean, ugh, come on. I love it so much. And actually, it's in the bag that my Hanson Roberts was in for a long time, which came from this thing. And I don't know if you can see this, but I've used this bag so much over the years, and it's been out in the sun so long it's faded, and it's actually it's really getting worn, but it's 20 years old almost. So. Love the Shadowscapes so much. And after that, I became very promiscuous with decks, and I haven't really, for a long time, had a deck, or hadn't, you know, in a few years had a deck that I really sunk into for a while and worked with almost exclusively, and then came the Wild Unknown, which I hemmed and hawed about for a long time because it was not Rider-Waite-Smith based, which is the only technique that I used. And I missed the first edition, and then the second edition came out, and I bought a couple copies of it. Some of my favorite cardstock ever. My one regret is that I did not get the original backs, which I loved. I'm ashamed to admit, I was suckered on Amazon into buying what I thought was a first edition and what turned out to be a bootleg. So I do have a version with the original backs, but it's not, you know... I don't use it because it's, you know, it's copyright infringement. So why is this deck? So I fell in love with this deck when I got it. I watched people do it, and I really actually, I wanted it and then didn't want it because it became really popular. Love the Hermit. Oh my god. And then I thought, oh, if it's really popular, I'm probably going to hate it. But I don't hate it. And here's what I'll say. This deck, if the Shadowscapes marked a moment where I transitioned into really becoming a great reader, well, that sounds really arrogant, where I made a commitment to becoming a great reader. This deck taught me about opening myself up to different systems because I couldn't, you know, when I started working with this deck, I was really relying on memories of the pictures of Rider-Waite-Smith. But over time, I started listening to this deck more, and it opened me up to different ways of reading. And this was my gateway into pip decks. This was the drug that got me into Marseille and to the pip decks that I love. And so this deck was a really pivotal connection as well. And I've paused on this card because this card taught me a lot about this card, just in terms of the way it's read, which is the idea that our past, you know, dissolves, it disintegrates, it rots essentially, but it forms the fertilization. It forms the fertilizer that our present is growing out of. I haven't looked at this deck in a while because I worked with this intensely for 4 or 5 months, if not longer, and then started experimenting with Marseille and learning numerology. Doing the work that became Tarot on Earth, and I don't return to it all that much, but just looking at it right now, I'm having the same kind of emotional reaction that I have to the Shadowscapes, which is that I have such deep devotion to this deck and what it taught me, and to the art of it, which I think is really beautiful. And I think this deck is something else too. What I've realized in recent months, as I've gotten more decks in my collection, like the Anima Mundi, the Naked Heart is on its way. There are others, and I realized that this deck is its own new system, and it's influencing a lot of artists. So in a way, this deck has become sort of the new, a new third or fourth. You know, there's Marseille / the early Italian decks, right, which were card game decks. Then there's the branch of Golden Dawn decks, Waite Smith and Crowley Harris, that those two systems have influenced most modern decks. But now I think Kim Cran's created something that's influencing folks in a different way. In terms of simplicity, in terms of nature, in terms of the you know, animal energy. I think she has created with this deck something that is influencing new decks. You can see it in the Anima Mundi. You can see it in the Naked Heart, which I don't have yet. I think you can see it in the Pagan Otherworlds. I think she really created something influential, and you can, I don't know, you just I think this deck was the beginning of a new era of tarot decks for people, for artists and for readers, you know, and obviously this was an influential moment, and certainly was a turning point for me as a reader. And this remains a deck that I find so intensely I find myself so intensely connected to in such a surprising way. That even as I'm looking at it now, I'm thinking, oh, this needs to come down off the shelf again, because it just sings, you know? So, and actually I think there's oh God, I don't know, I just really love everything about this deck. I really do. I have 2 copies of this version. The guidebook I never bought was gifted to me. I don't have the mass market edition because I have 2 of these, and I never got around to getting the Animal Spirit Oracle because I don't really work with oracles all that much. But man, does this deck just move me. I don't know. It's really interesting. We're such lucky readers now. You know what I mean? There's so much to choose from. There's so much to look at and have and engage with, and you know, also this community. I was talking to someone recently about, you know, the real sort of generosity of spirited people in this particular YouTube tarot community is really, really sort of exceptional. And I don't say that lightly, because I have other parts of my life that are filled with communities, but I think that this one is exceptionally unique and great and powerful. So anyway, this deck. These decks. Now, interestingly, not all of these are my favorite decks. Not all of these are decks that I would take to a desert island. I would say right now, if I had to choose my desert island top 3, that'd be really tough. It would be the Shadowscapes, this one, and probably the Japaridza right now, and I would sneak the Marshmallow into my pocket because it's so small. But that changes frequently. But I think that would give me a broad enough view. Anyway, I really love this deck. I love this cardstock. That's another reason I never got the mass market edition. I've never really had the feeling of the first version, which I know is even thicker than this. But Whoops. God, I really wish I could not hit the tripod when I do videos, but the weird thing is like my arm is coming through the middle of the tripod here, so it's just how it goes because I can't have my chair behind it in reach because I have short Tyrannosaurus Rex arms. So I've always loved the way this deck shuffles. It actually it reminds me a little bit of the Mermaid Tarot I showed the other day, but this is even better. Like, there's just no other cardstock like this. I don't know where it came from, but I love it so much. So these are the decks that I have used over the years as sort of my primary reading deck for like an extended period of time, with the exception of the Albano 8, which was like not an extended period of time, which was just a very like short, intense period of time. But these are the decks that I would argue shaped me as a reader, certainly. These were the decks that marked turning points in my reading. They were the decks that I really found my initial successes as a reader with, and that that brought me up. And so these are the decks that so far were my workhorses. And I don't know. I think that the Japarids is definitely going to join this crew. The Marshmallow Marseilles, it's sort of its own animal, but definitely in this collection. And it's an interesting thing what decks earn their places here. They're never the ones I expect necessarily, but they are the ones that belong there. So, anywho, I thought this was interesting to share. I don't know if, excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze. I don't know if there's been other videos like this over the years because I'm sort of out of date on catching up on things, but I'd love to hear what your workhorse decks were over the years, or what the decks were that sort of shaped you. And I don't know that there's a tag to do, but if you want to do like a response to this, I'd love to, let me know in the comments, because I'd love to see what yours were. I find this stuff really intensely interesting. So those are my decks that have shaped me so far. Curious to see what the next ones will be, but I hope this was interesting, and I hope you have a good weekend, and be good.